Welcome, everybody, to Harbor's Bible study, and we are continuing this week with the Psalms, and we have introduced, cheering crowd noise, with us a special guest, my friend, Reverend Dr. Daniel Rosenberg, and I'm so excited about having him. Yay, jazz hands. I really am excited about having him here. He is thoughtful. He is one of the most widely read people I know, and he has I don't want to put him on the spot. He has this ability to kind of pull from so many different places that especially people in our circles don't always have access to. So everything he says seems wonderful and amazing. And I'm just so glad to have my friend here to talk about the Psalms tonight. I think I've mentioned before that Rabbi Dan and I met at NYU. And one of the interesting things about it is we didn't have any classes in common. We were both there for many years and not one class did we have in common. But we met because the department is big and rich and lots of opportunity to meet people. And when we met, we realized that we had a lot of things in common. We cared very much about a thoughtful, reflective engagement with scripture and commentaries and faith traditions, and wanted to put that in conversation with the real world and our faith communities, because we care very much about what it looks like to live faith-filled lives in conversation with all that our traditions bring to the table. And so we became friends while we were at NYU. We have remained friends throughout all of this, through life changes and everything. And I'm just so excited to have him here tonight. So we are going to engage with Psalm 82 tonight. And so for the most part, I'm just going to hand it over to Rabbi Dan. I'm going to stay out of the way and try and be as helpful as possible with the conversation or the tech needs on the backside. So, Rabbi Dan, welcome. We're so glad you're here.
Thank you. I am very glad to be here. I want to start with a little bit, just by way of introduction, for explaining or for giving some disclaimer is not the right word. Just me and Psalms. I've been engaging with Psalms as religious literature more intensely for about 30 years. And that engagement comes in a Jewish space, deeply in the liturgical. There's a fixed and regular liturgy that is in the traditional ritual Jewish space. And different Psalms come up in different places. Some Psalms come up multiple times in the same day. Some Psalms come up once a week. There's a Psalm that comes up every day for 1 month of the year in the high holiday season, 40 days of the year, a little bit more than a month. But Psalm 82 was after I had been in the cycle of time. Psalm 82 is the Tuesday Psalm. That when I was in seminary, at the end of maybe my second or third year, we were given a midway assessment. And you went to the dean's office, and the dean gave you 3 texts in Hebrew in an envelope and said, you have 2 hours. You may not use any translations. You may use lexicons, but go and prepare a translation of the text in this envelope and be prepared to talk about it and to defend your translation. And Psalm 82 was one of the things in my envelope. And one of the people on my Let's See How He's Doing committee was a Bible professor at the seminary. And I presented my translation, which was not a typical translation. And the Bible professor very generously, rather than saying, well, that's totally wrong, said, explain how you got there. And did me the supportive kindness of saying, you read this in a way that is not the way that many people normally read this, but it brings interesting light to it. So I have to give that preface. This is something that in a moment of I don't know, translational naivete, I went in a particular direction and has continued to color the way that I read this. So if we go to start, like to start with a more typical translation of it, which is itself theologically interesting and a little challenging just on its face, and then try to turn it into something that's maybe a less typical translation and explain a little bit why other places in Hebrew Bible give us the opportunity to read it in a different way. And see how that may give us a useful alternative reading to have in tension or in balance with the more typical reading. So let's go to Psalm 82. And yes, great. If I would want to ask someone who'd be willing to read it in English, is there anyone who'd be willing to put themselves into that?
I'm good. I'll start.
So let me then, if I may, first, just because this is how if you will permit me this, I would like to read it in Hebrew first, trying to give just a sense of the sound and the rhythm. With what you see in the left column, it doesn't specifically give the parsing into the hemistiches, into the, let me back up half a step. Biblical poetry, and particularly in Psalms, the poetry of it doesn't rely on a rhyme scheme and doesn't rely on a distribution of syllables and doesn't rely, as you start to see in like medieval Islamic and Hebrew poetry, relying on long and short vowels. There's a variety of ways you can build poetic structure, but it often has semi-repetitive phrases where there'll be a statement and then a slightly different reflection of a similar thought that sort of expands it in a kind of mythic fashion. If you look at in the Hebrew, under the 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth character on the second line, that one, there's a little inverted horseshoe or an inverted tuning fork. And those are the places where I will be making the pauses. That's the middle of the line marker in Hebrew biblical poetry. The first two words, Mizmor la'asaf, are a title, but they are part of the psalm as we received it. Mizmor la'asaf, Elohim nitzav ba'adat el, bekerev Elohim yishpot. Ad matai tishpetu avel, ufnei reshaim tis'u, Selah. Shiftu dal v'yatom, oni varash hatzdiku, paltu dal ve'evyon, miyad reshaim hatzilu. Lo yad'u ve'lo yavinu, b'chashecha yitalachu, yamotu kolmos de'aretz. Ani amarti Elohim atem, uvnei elyon kulchem, achen ka'adam temutun, ucha'achad hasarim tipolu. Kuma Elohim shofetah haaretz, ki ata tinchal bechol hagoyim. And Corey, if you would.
You bet.
Thank you.
God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked, Selah? Give justice to the weak and the orphan. Maintain the right to the lowly and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. They have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk around in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. I say, you are gods, children of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, you shall die like mortals and fall like any prince. Rise up, O God, judge the earth, for all the nations belong to you.
Okay. So on the first level, the word, the translation in the NRSV reflects something that in the Hebrew is structurally very plain. God has taken his place in the divine council. Elohim nitzav be'adatel. In the midst of the gods, b'kerev Elohim yishpot. One slight thing that I want to point out that the English doesn't, that we may push the Hebrew a little bit to push the English, that lihit yatsev, nitzav, is to stand. So one of the things that God taking God's place in the divine council also emphasizes is that although elders at a gate or a council might be sitting together in judgment, in this case, nitzav may imply that God has a different posture in regard to the other members of the council. Now, the first thing that jumps out for me as challenging or disturbing in a monotheistic space is who are those gods? Wait a second, we said God, but who are these other gods in this divine council? And that, on the one hand, can feel problematic. But if we allow ourselves to go back 3,000 years into the mindset of Israelite biblical religion in the midst of the cultures surrounding it, there seem to be implications in the Hebrew Bible that the expectation of people in the world at that time was that every nation had its own God, had its sponsors, maybe not the right word, patron God, and individual nations' gods were effectual and powerful regarding their nations in their land. I don't know, I always had this, it's probably from a television show when I was a kid, but police pursuing the misguided always hero across a county line or a state line, and just far enough that, oh, sorry, you don't have jurisdiction here. You can't arrest me in the next county over. And that there is something that the language of the psalm, when plainly read, seems to be that God is speaking to other gods. But there's a place where it feels like there is equal adat el, the council of God or the divine council, that there are other gods going on there, but that God, who is God, is in a different place morally in terms of the conversation that's about to begin. And it seems clear that from the ethical perspective, that question, how long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked, is coming out as a stinging rebuke and a harsh criticism. This is something that you all are allowing and doing. Yes. Which is incorrect, and that God has a moral authority in regards to these other gods to rebuke them. The Selah, by the way, is probably is thought, I'll put it that way, is thought to be something of a musical notation. And while it doesn't bear into the content meaning of the psalm. So it seems clear that these various other gods, these powers who are in the conversation, are doing things inappropriately. Ad matai tishbatu avel, we'll come back to that, and that you will lift up, show partiality to the wicked, brings us back to, I wonder, does yours have that footnote? I don't know if it's Deuteronomy 117. I made this note here. Deuteronomy, no.
24, 17.
Does it say 24? I thought that's the Deuteronomy 1:7, 82:3. No. It's Ufnei Rishaim Tisu. Maybe it's that. Will you please go to the Deuteronomy 24 bit? There's something in the I've got so many books open. It's just trying to find out where all of my notes are. No.
Oh,
that's
I think
interesting.
Yeah.
That's not where I was going to go with that.
Okay.
I will, because I can't find it promptly, I will leave it. But there is a.
Is it 419?
Thank you. Let me double check. There's a prohibition against showing favor, and that idea of lifting up face. Oh, 419, I think, is too early. Nope. Oh, that's interesting also. Let me just go ahead and I'll try to move that forward. This showing partiality is literally that you will lift up the faces. And there is a concern biblically in regards of showing favor when administering justice. And as we're going to see between verse 2 and verse 3, there is opposition between those who are described as wicked, who are unfairly getting advantage in the administration of justice. The people who are being deprived of justice with suit is also not the right word, but people are going to court, are using the structures of justice to oppress, and the people who are getting the short end of the stick in these judgments that the other gods are permitting are the weak and the orphan, the lowly and the destitute, the weak and the needy. And seems to imply that when we go to the end of verse 4, deliver them from the hand of the wicked, that these wicked people are ones who have status, certainly, and potentially financial leverage that the people who are experiencing oppression do not have access to. That they are the ones who seem like they are able to potentially bribe judges in a real. And it starts to feel like there is, if we're looking at this among gods, where it's already starting to get clunky and awkward to try to figure out what would induce gods to give face, to show partiality to the wicked, to lift up the face of the wicked. There is an immorality in the application of the ethics, that it seems like by God being allowed to rebuke, or being able to rebuke these other gods, everyone knows what the rules are supposed to be. Everyone understands that justice is supposed to be equally accessible and equally distributed. But in practice, the ones who are being rebuked by God in this divine council are allowing that process to be subverted. That subverted I want to come back to in a moment. Nope, actually we can do that now. So we've got this rebuke from God to these judges and others. I'd like to ask you, if you have it handy, to flip over and look for a moment at Isaiah chapter 3. And particularly verses 13 to 15. I'm going to start with that. So one of the things that when we go to try to make sense of this, we have a similar stance, posture. And that posture is reflected in that same word nitzav, where in Psalm 82, Elohim nitzav be'adatel, we had been translating that as God has taken his place in the divine council. Here the Lord rises to argue his case. He stands to judge the people. That different posture in regards to the other people who are there is specifically relevant by the word choice, and the conversation that God has in Isaiah 3 feels like it feels similar to what's going on in our psalm. The Lord enters into judgment with the elders and princes of his people, and it begins to give us a space of seeing that this rebuke certainly would make sense between God and human leaders, people who are charged with administering the divine law among the people. I'm thinking back to Exodus 17, when Jethro comes and sees Moses running himself ragged, and people like to joke that Jethro is the first executive coach, and says, listen, you've got to delegate, and you have to have a number of elders who will hear the law from you, and they will administer it to the people. In this case, in Isaiah 3, God is rebuking these judges, these elders and princes who seem to be the ones who are entrusted with the administration of judgment. It is you who have devoured the vineyard. The spoil of the poor is in your house. What do you mean by crushing my people, by grinding the face of the poor? Malachem tedak'u ami. Malachem tedaku. That crushing gives us the feeling of the experience of the people at this non-administration of justice, but those people who are on the sometimes at the end of the day I have to focus extra to get the words out. Some of those same groups of people who are socially disadvantaged in Psalm 82, Isaiah 3 is giving us some of that same language and helping us understand that the rebuke that God is giving to the gods in Psalm 82, if we start with that translation, Amy, I saw your hand, please excuse me, let me finish. I will call on you in just a moment. The experience of injustice is by people who have a reasonable right to expect that justice should be done within a just system, and that there is something happening between the establishment of the expectation of justice in the middle whether it is by other nations' gods or whether it is by designated people whose job it is to ensure justice, that's subverting or perverting the process, that's taking it to the side. Amy. Unless.
That might have been Declan.
Okay.
Playing with the controls. We'll just
Great.
keep going.
So the other place that I wanted to ask to look is to also flip over, please, to Psalm 58. And we can see that Psalm 58 similarly has something that thematically, I've got too many Bibles. So I'm going to read from the Jewish Publication Society, which is the, it's probably going to come out similar to the NRSV. O mighty ones, do you really decree what is just? Do you judge mankind with equity? In your minds, you devise wrongdoing in the land. With your hands, you deal out lawlessness. The wicked are defiant from birth. The liars go astray from the womb. Their venom is like that of a snake, a deaf viper that stops its ears, so as not to hear the voice of charmers or the expert mutterer of spells. O God, smash their teeth in their mouth, shatter the fangs of lions, O Lord. Let them melt, let them vanish like water, let him aim his arrows that they be cut down like a snail that melts away as it moves. That's really a lovely image. It's like frogs spontaneously generating from the mud in medieval Europe, I think was interesting. Like a woman's still, like the untimely birth that never sees the sun. Okay. Before the thorns grow into a bramble, may he whirl them away alive in a fury. And then this is something that between verse 7 and 12 seems to feel like the end of our psalm. The righteous man will rejoice when he sees revenge. He will bathe his feet in the blood of the wicked. Men will say, there is then a reward for the righteous. There is indeed divine justice on earth. Certainly Psalm 58 goes there in a way that Psalm 82 doesn't seem to, with the celebration of the revenge. But Psalm 82 still has that call to God to rise up and ensure that justice is being done, not for its own sake, but for the sake of people who are suffering as a result of it. So we have back in Psalm 82, what God seems to be giving to the rebuke that God is giving to the judges at the council. The NRSV continues with verse 5 as something that's outside of the rebuke and reflecting from the side on what is problematic about those judges. They have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk around in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. The fact that the foundations of the earth are shaken makes it clear an expectation that the world should be founded on justice, and in fact, fundamentally is founded on justice. That the administration of justice is a law of nature, and that the going against it through the choice to make injustice happen is like, feel like it's holding of the motor when the motor wants to go a certain way and you get that grinding. It's been many years since I damaged someone's manual transmission, but I think that may be what I was doing. Megan and Chris?
Christian.
No, not Chris.
Yes.
Christian.
You're fine.
Thank you.
So how do we know that verse 5 or 4, or is it 6, depending on the translation, is a separate, a separate statement apart from the quotes essentially that are being said? Like how do we not know that this isn't talking about like the weak people or the people that are in need they do not know what they understand or nor do they understand, they walk around in darkness.
So I would like to commend you on your question, because where we put the quotes, where we decide that God's rebuke to the other gods ends, is a matter of interpretation. In this case, if we start with something in Hebrew, it's clear that there's an address to a multiple group of people. So if I were to use an older English, I would read this as, how long will ye judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Give ye justice to the weak and the orphan, maintain ye the right of the lowly and the destitute. Verses 2, 3, and 4 seem to be given in second person plural. And when we get to what's here, verse 5, we do see that there is a shift. So now we're speaking in the third person. They have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk around in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. So to now get very specifically to your question, in the way that biblical language is structured, my experience of it, single verses are often idea units. So the fact of them, you know what? I have to back up, because my explanation doesn't give a clear answer to your question. If the people who are oppressed have neither knowledge nor understanding and walk around in darkness, that oppression could be the thing that causes the foundations of the earth to be shaken. The thing that I would, I just have to see in my brain, where is this? I think this is Psalm 1.
While you're looking, Dan, can I follow up with one thing you said that I think was right on point?
Yes.
So, for instance, in verse 82 here, so ad matai, how long? Tishfatu, right? This letter right here, this very first one, this tav, it looks like I don't know what it looks like. Looks like a tav to me. It's the thing that tells you it's in the second person, which means y'all, right? You all judge. You all judge, okay? And then this here, tisu, right? Y'all basically lift the faces of the wicked, okay? So those are the kinds of verbs you get in verses 2, 3, and 4. All of them have this y'all aspect to it. I'm trying to speak Southern here. I'm translating from Hebrew to Southern. Mm-hmm. When we get to verse 5, from Hebrew to just normal English, right? Lo yadu, right, is now third person. So it's now they. So it's no longer a direct address from the speaker or the author of the psalm to someone, or from putting it in the mouth of God to the other gods. It's now God to the hearer of the psalm, as in the third person over there. They do not know, and they do not understand. And that's how we recognize this shift, at least in part. So I don't know that fully answers your question, Christian, but that's at least one of the aspects that Dan was talking about there.
And I'm going to follow up on that, Christian, by saying, if we look over at Psalm 115, 3 through 8, the description of God in contrast to not real gods is that they have appearance of capability, but they don't have the actual real potential for that. So where Psalm, not having knowledge or understanding and walking around in darkness, is not something that you can really blame a person for unless they adhere, stick to it. I had a friend, speaking of Southern, I went to the University of Virginia. There were not a lot of Jews at the University of Virginia at that time, and I was a bit of a novelty. I was a lot of people's first Jew. And I had a friend who was had met two other Jews. So like there was more, background there. And she appreciated the fact that there were a lot of people who might have thoughts in their brains and they wouldn't say it with their outside voice. And some people who said all kinds of remarkable things with their outside voices. And she just wanted to make sure that I had context for it. And she said, listen, you got to understand, there's two kinds of ignorant. There's ignorant because no one ever taught you any better. And people can grow out of that. And then there's ignorant because people are just mean. And there's nothing you can do for that but drown them when they're puppies. So I think in her idiomatic framing, what she was trying to help me understand is when we talk about ignorance, there is a kind of ignorance that there's no shame in. It's easily correctable. The thing that is socially repugnant is when people have the opportunity to make a better choice and insist on holding on to something that is hurtful to others. And so I think that if we're looking at Psalm 82 in contrast to Psalm 115, not having knowledge or understanding, I feel like there's a lot of, oh gosh, so many things in my head. Maslow's pyramid of needs, or as is ascribed to Maslow, but even just understanding, I have chronic pain. And in the last number of years, it's changed the way that my brain cognitive functions can work. And when we started trying to deal with the chronic pain, after I had a really remarkable flare that I was prescribed a medication that started to deal with the pain, but also I just couldn't, I lost a month and a half. The same things that, the same chemicals that transmit pain signals are the neurotransmitters that also help things like memory. And what we balanced out with was that there was just going to be a point where for me to try to have access to my brain, I had to make a choice. And what that has meant in the since time is that my place with my doctors is that when my brain has to use a certain amount of its processor to deal with managing pain or imminently expecting pain, the amount, it's like the thing on the computer that tells you, oh, wow, your process is using 145% because, there's some other process going on in the background that's running. The capacity that you have for the other things goes down. And so it's not surprising, my doctor said, if you have difficulty remembering because your brain is spending so much time trying to deal with the pain. It could be understandable in the context of Psalm 82 that people who are oppressed might not have the sort of spiritual energy to not be in a place of darkness or understanding. And that being said, a reason that I choose in verse 5 to keep that on the ones who are being rebuked is twofold. Number one, it helps frame or parenthesize or bookend this rebuke of the ones who are doing unjustly. And to go back to what Corey pointed out, something that's not, and Corey, please keep me in what's the word when we interpret, keep me in homiletics, in good reading and out of homiletical space on this one. But in verse 1, when in the English it seems fairly straightforward, it actually is clear in the English. God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of gods, he holds judgment. That nitzav is in a perfect construct, meaning it's a definitive action which has ended. B'kerev Elohim yishpot appears as though it is future. I'm going to call that imperfect, meaning that there's an ongoing action. So there's a subtle difference in the grammatical construct between how God is depicted by the way those verbs are constructed. When we go down to verse 5, in the Hebrew, what we see is lo yada'u, they have not understood, velo yavinu, and they will not understand. It's that same parallel of definitive past tense and ongoing present or future. So I feel like that the verse 5 has to be set up because of a very subtle grammatical structure pairing to contrast the subject of those ones who have not knowledge and understanding in contrast with God, who is standing up to give this rebuke. So that I understand that I tie that in because of that with verse 1 in opposition. But what your question is a fair and good question, because when we go to look at it, there's also a general rule and understanding that when you have non-specified pronouns, this is what we're taught. I think I was taught this in 7th grade. I'm not sure. If you can name someone at the beginning of the paragraph, and as long as you don't name somebody else and the person's pronouns are consistent without anyone else who shares the same pronouns in the course of the paragraph, you don't have to repeat their name because you assume that there's consistency in that. And so, Christian, your point that the most recent people, actually, I'm going to put it right back. So, Christian, please read the end of verse 4, who are immediately before the unspecifically named they.
Deliver them from the hand of the wicked?
Yeah.
Okay.
So on that point, we might also say that the most recently named are the wicked, and that might be support or an argument for taking us back into that direction. That the wicked one now perhaps could be more specifically argued as oppressing the humans who are oppressive. If we go with what my 7th grade English teacher drummed into my head. But I think that your question, the value of your question still stands, that when we're looking particularly in poetic structures where there isn't necessarily always that clear narrative, that in poetry we can change direction very quickly, but we have to have a compelling reason to justify. I think that your reading is a good interpretation. I think that there are pieces in the grammar that may keep us more on those people who have neither knowledge nor understanding, either be the ones who are behaving wickedly, whose behavior is being elevated by the judges, by the gods who should know better, or the gods themselves who are advocating for their constituents who are behaving unjustly. In verse 6, it seems clear that now we are getting to, Ani Amarti, the narrator here is not God. The narrator is the one who is describing the divine. Pamalia in English is like the divine counsel, the divine conversation. Verse 5 stands in a slightly different place, but in verse 6, there
does
is
that not
a
answer
narrator.
the question?
Sorry?
Does that not answer the question? Verse 6 answers who verse 5 is about?
Maybe.
Okay.
I'll tell. So, Corey, why do you think verse 6 answers why the question about what verse 5 is about.
Right. It seems like there's this continuity between, it says who they are, and then it goes on to address who they are. I say, y'all are gods. And so therefore, those who are walking around in darkness are the Elohim part of the divine council who are dealing unjustly. And I think there's that continuity.
If we look to the order of the psalm to give us the continuity, that would make sense. If we understand potentially verse 5 as an aside, as a descriptive aside from a neutral third person, when we come back to verse 6, now we have someone taking once again a first person stance. I say, you are God's children of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, you shall die like mortals and fall like any prince. Number one, an easy place for this, particularly for us who are reading Psalms, is that I say is the human who's observing the gods fighting in heaven. Now I, as a human being, understand that you gods of other nations who advocate for injustice, you may be divine, but, and now this is going to get to what makes it awkward about this, is you shall die like mortals and fall like any prince. And suddenly those other nations' gods are not divine, that they are, because they choose human injustice, they've become human limited. So this could be the human pious person who understands that God's advocating for justice in the heavens. Second possibility is that now we're going back, and this now is a continuation of the quote of the speech of God rebuking these other gods. I, God, the true God, the God who advocates for justice, say to all of you in this divine council, you may be gods in little g gods, but you're not divine. And what proves your non-divinity is that you advocate for injustice. And therefore, you shall die like mortals and fall like any prince. The fact that verse 8, rise up, O God, judge the earth, for all the nations belong to you, feels like Psalm 50, a little bit like Psalm 58, that exhortation, the human exhortation, go God, you do it. You get up in that council, you make justice happen. Rise up, O God, judge the earth, for all the nations belong to you. Literally, this is a really sweet tying things together, because whereas at the beginning we might have been dealing with the idea that each nation has its own patron god in the heavens, at this point, our theological assertion is quite clear. The God of justice, there's one God, because there can't be a divine council that is unjust, that undermines its divinity. And so when we, the human being, reading this prayer, reading the psalm, go through the experience of seeing this divine council, it should inspire us to root for God. God, rise up and make justice happen. You be the one, you who advocate for justice, you who recognize the poor and the downtrodden and the orphan and the destitute. You be the one who administers justice for us, because we know that you are not limited as the divine. You're not parochially excluded to one little corner of the world. You are the God over all. And please, therefore, exercise your right. Don't cede in a polite fashion. I now give the floor to the gentleman from Assyria. No. You give us justice, please, because you're in charge of all the people. I want to pause there and ask, does anyone have questions or thoughts they want to throw into the mix?
I'm thinking a little bit about verse 8 and this shift to the human voice. Go God. You know, like I mean, it's this reminder that the locus of speaking is shifting throughout this entire psalm. And here it ends in this recognition from humanity to God. And I like the, I don't know whether you said it explicitly or it's kind of what was evoked in my mind when you kind of said this cheerleading of like, hey, go God, rise up, judge the earth, do your thing, go, go. That I can't help but think that this is like one dot in the evidence for the shift from Israel as a henotheistic society towards monotheism. And this is like that one moment we capture them in time where we see, oh, they haven't gotten to monotheism yet, but they're really beginning to realize what differentiates our God from their gods. And we can articulate it clearly and well here. And while we're not quite yet ready to say they're not gods, we sure see a difference. I don't know, the flood of thoughts. I'm not sure there's anything you want to take from that.
So I think that's a good take on this. And I'm absolutely going to problematize that in the next 5 minutes.
Please do.
The last thing I do want to say about verse 8 is that Kuma Elohim, rise up, O God, Shoftah haaretz. If we understand verse 1, Elohim nitzav ba'adat el, not just as God has taken his place in the divine council, but God is standing in the divine council. It brings us back to that place where at the beginning, if God is nitzav ba'adat el and standing, now God is standing alone at the end of the psalm, and that God has dispensed with unjust counsel, counsel, from God's counsel, as it were. But now, going back to that word in Hebrew, and this is one reason that this is...
one quick nerdy question.
Yes.
He's standing in verse 1, but then it says rise up in verse 8.
Yes.
I don't know. Maybe it's just this, one way of understanding kum plus a verb is this idea of incipient action. Begin to judge.
Yes.
Okay.
I like that. Thank you.
Yeah, I like that too. Because if he's already standing, kum saying rise up is not literal, it's metaphorical. It's that begin to judge. Like you've laid out your case, boom, ready, go. Lay out but now I want to stop talking and listen to you.
For another example of that, I think where you look is Genesis 21. I think Kumi Se'iyat Na'ar, when Ishmael is when Hagar has thrown Ishmael under the bush so that she does not see the death of the young man. After the angel reassures her, I think the angel says to her, Kumi Se'iyat Na'ar. Just go ahead and pick up the youth. But let's go back now, because where we were in that rebuke in verse 6 and 7, whomever it is that is this narrator at this point, whether it is a human narrator or the divine narrator, we see a shift in the way that the status of these Elohim, Ani Amarti, I had said, I used to think, Elohim atem uvnei elyon kulchem, that you are gods, children of the Most High, all of you. But nonetheless, you shall die as mortals, and like any prince, you shall fall. That seems like it gives us an opening clearly to understand that the understanding of Elohim, of these unjust rulers that we had at the beginning, if they can die like people, then they are in fact people. And part of the challenge, and this now goes back to what Christian had said or proposed about verse 5, who does not have knowledge or understandings and walks in the darkness? Human beings do have a propensity to idolize people in power. And to understand that leadership is something that people who are already leaders do, that there's something inherent or I guess I can't think of the other word that is like inherent, but is in who that person is. But that's also something that we ascribe. I had said that you are gods and children of the Most High. This B'nai Elyon is also challenging in, was it Genesis 7, in the pre-flood, that the B'nai Elohim are the ancestors of the Nephilim were in the land, and they are the progenitors of the mighty ones. To bring it back to Corey's point, there may be these residues of myths going on of where did these fallen angels come from? How did that happen? It's not explicated in the biblical text. How were there B'nai Elohim, children of God, or B'nai Elyon, children of the Most High? That seems pretty clear. But if we take it for a moment that this is a human being ceding divine or semi-divine status to people, I'd have to explain why I could possibly argue, where I might ever get that from, that you would ever be allowed to say that the word Elohim, I just pulled my bookmark out of my New Revised Standard. Okay, well, I'll do the hard work and flip all the way back to Exodus 21, and it'll be okay. If you would go back, please, 2 places I want to look. Exodus 21, verse 6. The context is that the verse requires manumission of slaves every 6 years. It doesn't understand slavery as the idea that a human being has a right to own another human being. What it seems to be in this case in Exodus 21 is indenture, that you get paid in advance for up to 6 years of your labor. That up to 6 years is defined by the sabbatical year because all debts get neutralized in the sabbatical year. And if you were going to indenture someone's labor, you would figure it on the basis of how much time you have. If I rack up really horrible debts and I need to pay off my debtors, I can get paid in advance, promise my work to somebody for a certain amount of time. If I decide in verse 5, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out a free person. The NRSV translates this as, then his master shall bring him before God. And if you look at the little note in A, 21:6, or the judges who act in God's name, to the judges, that word Elohim, I'm sorry, down here on the bottom in the box next to the font changing. No. That letter A, yep. Way down there. The alternative reading of Lifnei Elohim is before the judges. If you flip forward a page and you look at 22:7, when someone delivers to a neighbor money or goods for safekeeping, and they are stolen from the neighbor's house, then the thief, if caught, shall pay double. If the thief is not caught, the owner of the house shall be brought before God to determine whether or not the owner had laid hands on the neighbor's goods. And similarly, in verse 9, if any case of disputed ownership involving ox, donkey, sheep, clothing, or any other loss of which one party says, this is mine, the case of both parties shall come before God. The one whom God condemns shall pay double to the other. But again, in this case, there's something from the context that suggests that we can understand Elohim in Hebrew as being human judges who are acting as administrators of the divine law and ensuring that justice is done among people who live who are experiencing conflict with each other. So that if we then go back to Psalm 82, it means that any place that God is not capitalized in this psalm, where it is lowercase, I want to propose reading that as human judges. So Psalm 82, that's not Psalm 82. God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the human judges, he holds judgment. So now that divine council, Adat El, becomes something like the way that we talk about God, taking counsel with God's self. For another case of this, we could look at Genesis 11. And let me look at Genesis 11 because I need to make sure that I get the words right if I'm going to ask to bring this as an example. In the Tower of Babel, in the beginning of the chapter, verse 7, God says, "Come, let us go down and confuse their language there so that they will not understand one another's speech." My note says, look at Genesis 1:26 as well. Another case of God, let us make humankind in our image according to our likeness. In 21st century English, if we enjoy watching, which I haven't, but I understand people do. What is it? The Crown, that's the show. The royal we do not approve of this plan, Mr. whomever it might be. That plurality, the divine council is that aspect of God sort of having dialogue with God's self, the reflective space. Oh, I will have to ask, kids always know the tech. I need to figure out how to get my shiny glasses.
No, you really, really don't. And I kept switching it and he kept sliding under. So sorry to interrupt, Dan.
No worries. God has taken his place in the reflective conversation back in Psalm 82, in the act of taking counsel with God's self. In the midst of the judges, he holds judgment. And now God is saying something's not going right with this process. Let's reflect on this. These human beings who have been appointed as my agents in administering justice, ensuring that the poor are not oppressed, that the orphan and the stranger are not excluded, are not doing what they're supposed to be doing. I have appointed you to this role of responsibility. How long are you going to judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? That is contrary to what I, God, have specifically told you, my human agents, to do. You should give justice to the weak and the orphan. You should maintain the right of the lowly and the destitute. You should rescue the weak and the needy, and you should deliver them from the hand of the wicked. And then when we shift to the third person, there's silence. They are not hearing God's rebuke. And because they have knowledge nor understanding, they're walking around in darkness. They are not acting in God's light. They are not spreading God's light. And as a result of that, the foundations of the earth are shaken. That God's will is being actively undone in the world by people, all of whom are expected to act justly, but especially the people who are the leaders. And then this verses 6 and 7, I think, still can be ambiguous about who it is that's speaking. This could be God saying, okay, I'm voting you off the island. That's another show I haven't watched. But again, like TV goes into my idiom, and here we go. God says, I used to say, Ani amarti, I have said that you are judges and like children of me myself. And nonetheless, Achen ka'adam temutun, I think that's Psalm 146. Al tiftachu bin divim beven adam she'en lo teshua, tetzei rucho yashuv la'admato bayom hahu avdu eshnotav, which in English probably means something like Al tiftachu bin divim. Do not trust in the mighty. Al tiftachu bin divim. This is the problem with an orally based memory, is if I lose the strand in trying to, V'vein adam she'en lo teshua. Thank you. In a human being in whom there is no essential salvation. Teitzei rucho yashuv la'admato. His soul shall go out. He shall return to the soil. Bayom hahu avdu eshnotav. On that day, all of his great plans will be for naught. So, yes, thank you, Corey. Do not put your trust in princes, in mortals in whom there is no help. When their breath departs, they return to their earth. On that very day, their plans perish. And this feels a lot like the rebuke in Psalm 82 in verses 6 and 7. Nevertheless, you shall die like mortals and fall like any prince. This is clearly speaking to humans in whom we have ascribed greater than human authority, whom we have conceded godlike power to, and that just hasn't been a good idea. And so what that means when we get back to verse 8, when we say, rise up, O God, judge the earth, for all the nations belong to you, that may be a human being taking back the reins of understanding that ensuring the justice in human systems, there's an ongoing need for humans to be part of that process. We can't offload justice without paying attention to ensure that justice continues to be done. Because if our justice system does not do justice, it's like Abraham says in Genesis 18, Hashofet kol haaretz lo ya'aseh mishpat. Will the judge of all the earth not do justice? You can't have a divine judge who creates justice and allows injustice to happen. And in our system, where human beings are entrusted with the administration of God's justice, if human beings are doing me'uvat, are twisting the justice such that injustice happens, then we have to also step in to rebuke them. Realizing that we can call upon God to judge the earth, to rise up and judge the earth, for the nations belong to you, is there also therefore feels to me also like a religious admission. I'm now going to get myself back to the place where I put my trust where it truly fits. That I'm calling on God to bring that judgment back to all the nations, and not to allow that these agents, if unchecked, be in a place where they are taking things in a direction that is not what God wants.
Dan, this is an amazing reading. I don't know yet what to think about it, but this idea that is well-founded and well-reasoned, this idea that the word Elohim has a broad semantic context that includes the notion of judges, is certainly well within the scope of what we talk about in biblical studies, for instance. And so reading it like that is intriguing, and I'm really excited about what you've just shared. I don't know if all of you are recognizing the way in which Dan has pulled together this rich word, this lexeme, Elohim, which is typically translated as God or gods. And even just that little dichotomy right there shows that it is not always just a one-to-one correspondence from Hebrew to English, but that it might include other things. I mean, certainly we use that word for things like divine. We use that, it can be used of potentially like of the dead. And in this case, it seems to be appropriately used for the idea of judges. And so that recasts this entire psalm as a critique of injustice in the human realm that should be reflective of what God has called us to. And I find this a really compelling reading. Like for all those words I just said, I'm almost speechless. Thank you, Dan, for this. Before, like, any questions, comments, or snide remarks that we would like to engage while we've got Dan as a reminder, it's 10:15 for him there. But do we have any questions before we sign off? I can appreciate how this is something that I think we might all want to sit with for a little bit. And as some of us get used to the way in which you present material, which is like, it's not a shock to anybody on this Zoom call, that this is not something that we are typically used to engaging scripture in this fashion, right? This is a very, very close reading that requires a breadth of biblical knowledge and pulls it all in together to make this very fine point. But that fine point has these huge implications. And that's the very reason I wanted to have Rabbi Dan here with us, because he presents a new way of looking at this that most of us are not used to. And so it might take us a little while before we can even figure out how to formulate a question. And that's cool.
I definitely have to chew on it in order to, I think, really process the questions or whatever, even those thoughts. I think the only thing that comes to mind in this reading of it, and I think reading like the human judges into it is the challenge that I have is on the verse 6. Does it lose any of its significance to read that straight as like I'm saying to you, or I have said that you are, if it's in that like perfect, imperfect place to say like, I have said or I have thought of you as, and it's still a picture of a human ruler, or is that something that we are to contrast with the way that it's being taken the other ways? So I guess, it's just as far as like how we're using the Elohim in that sense versus in the other senses that it's used in the Psalm.
And I think what Corey said about I'm sorry, there was something that you said that was I always have trouble with this phrase, the semantic range, maybe. That one of the things that makes this psalm really intriguing for me is that same word can definitely wiggle in the same psalm.
Right.
And so in this case, Ani amarti Elohim atem, this feels to me, I mean, this is also why I see this as the human narrator, that the ones who are administering justice in the experience of this person in verse 6, who is speaking directly to them after the divine rebuke, now has a totally different take on what their power actually is. And here I actually do like saying, I thought you were gods. And gods here has to be plural because of the second person plural pronoun atem is very clearly not speaking to you, God, in the singular. I thought you were gods. And now I realize after the single, the one God's rebuke of you, that in fact you are mortals. And that's why I take verse 6 and 7 to understand verse 7 has to inform verse 6. Because I am pretty sure, although I think in Sumerian literature, there was a god who died. Was it Tammuz? Like there's this whole thing where, but I don't know that it feels like it's common for actual divinities in the ancient Near East to actually die. So it feels like verse 7 saying, you shall die like mortals and fall like any prince, means that this human rebuke has to be to people. And so that I used to think that you are gods. Now I know different because I was wrong. Now, having seen God's rebuke, I understand that part of the failing is in my understanding. Is the wiggling intentional in order to communicate two messages in one statement? I took a class when Corey and I were at NYU and taking no classes together. I took a class over in the English department because there was someone in my cohort who kept talking about postmodernism, and he would drop this postmodern this and postmodern that, and I had no idea what he was saying. And it made me crazy because he never explained what he was saying. He just dropped these words to show that he knew what it was. So I went and I took a class in postmodern literary theory so that I could understand what the heck he was talking about. I think that it's hard, it's hard to understand what the intention of the author is. I can observe that there is a word that in Hebrew Bible can have different meanings. And I can look at this very concise poem and see that depending on how I understand that, this could go in really different directions. A little bit less in Psalms. I mean, Psalms is clearly poetry, and poets are often very careful about what words they choose to try to convey the most meaning in the most compact word package in order to evoke all of the things that they want us to be thinking about at the time. So I say that because my assumption of sort of the divinity, the question of the divinity of Psalms is a little bit less urgent. But I think that it's very much worth noting that it's worth noting and paying attention to the fact that Elohim can go in different places in biblical literature. And some people don't like that resonance with Exodus 21 and 22. They say, yeah, it's clearly though people would have been judging in the place where God is. So a common place in the Pentateuch for Moses to execute judgment is at the opening of the tent of meeting, that people bring their disputes to him there because that is the tent where God's presence is felt to the people. And so to say that bringing it to God, no one really thought you were maybe bringing a human, like my neighbor stole my eggs from under my chicken this morning. Are you bringing that to God? Well, if you bring it to God, then it makes it extra awkward for your neighbor to say, I didn't steal the eggs because God saw whether or not you stole the eggs, and you'll be embarrassed to say it in the front of the judges who sit in God's place. That being said, because there's ambiguity there, it gives us, I think, the range to understand and to see it, that word in resonance with how it works in other places, and to ask us how those places can help us reflect on what it could mean here as we're trying to figure out how to use this psalm to help us make sense of how to be people who seek justice and ensure that the destitute and the marginalized are not allowed to suffer because of our choice to refrain from engaging in supporting the justice for them.
I would add the whole semantic range and wiggle room that's going on there is in fact the poet's playground. That's exactly what they're trying to capitalize on, is the idea that I can use this word twice and mean two different things, and it catches you because that's the challenge I'm presenting for you. A little bit like we've talked about previously, how the prophets will say things like, especially in the oracles against the nations, you think they're so bad, we're worse, right? It's that playing on, like, are you looking at this one thing? Can you look at it from two ways and recognize that my point is perhaps not what you expected from my first statement of it, but it has another layer of meaning? Or as the great modern poet Lin-Manuel Miranda said in his seminal work, Hamilton, where what's her name says, Burr, you disgust me. And he responds, ah, but you've discussed me. So it's homophonous in that case, but it is this idea of playing on one sound bite that means two different things. let me go ahead and call an end to it at that for this evening. Never fret, though. We have 2 more weeks of this great gentleman, Rabbi Dan, with us, and we look forward to more. And I'm really excited about this. I'm going to stop sharing the screen just for this last moment so that we can all be together, see our lovely faces. Thank you for joining us this evening. I hope you have a wonderful week, and I look forward to seeing you all next week.
Well, and can I also just, so that Dan is hearing this, I've received several texts of people for a variety of reasons. They're like, please say this is recorded. So there are others who wanted to be here who were unable to be. So we'll have a few extra friends with us next week.
And with that, I will stop the recording.